Hey, welcome back, everybody. Dr. Greg Eckel and What the Health. Our topic today is mushrooms and psychedelics, a possible key to brain regeneration and longevity, or is it hype? My guest today is Robert Johnson. He's the founder and CEO of premium mushroom product company called MicroBoost and supplements manufacturer Custom Capsule Consultants. He's a cannabis and hemp industry veteran, health product expert, psychedelic advocate, and seasoned entrepreneur with 20 plus year track record of launching successful startup businesses in new and emerging markets. His pioneering product innovations and keen insights into the future of health marketplace have made him a sought after consultant, conference speaker, and op-ed contributor. His bylines, cannabis, hemp, Delta 8, kratom, and mushrooms of all kinds have appeared in Rolling Stone, Cannabis Industry Daily, MG Magazine, Natural Products Insider, Nutraceuticals World, Nutritional Outlook, and Green Entrepreneur. He's just fresh back from South by Southwest. Robert Johnson, welcome aboard.
Thanks a lot for that intro, Dr. Greg. Excited to talk to you.
Indeed. Yeah, this is a ever burgeoning world and kind of Wild West topic. And, selfishly, I want to talk about your experience in emerging markets because we're there. And then we're going to get into mushrooms, which is one of your expertise. But, you've been in cannabis, psychedelics is coming up here, ride sharing. They all began illegally and have or continue to be kind of on the fringe there, not ride sharing per se. But I want to talk about your experience on kind of catching that wave at the beginning and kind of that Wild West feel, and couching this really because we've got a bunch of health listeners out there of, how do you do this safe? It just seems like, so we were talking before we got on here, there's a shaman on every corner and there's this plant medicine and that plant medicine. And, there's some research and there's a lot of illegality. There's different realms of the world that you can go to, on all of the levels. I'm curious though, in the entrepreneur component, and what are you gleaning along this ride here of emerging markets and how to be safe as a consumer?
Yeah, great question. And I haven't heard many people compare it to ride sharing, but I've compared it to ride sharing as well, right? It's a disruption and giving people what they want, But yeah, my experience in emerging markets it started with inspiration, right? I find it like one of the most inspiring things of our generation that this group of activists in small areas, starting in cities and states, have gotten enough attention, signatures, ballots passed, that now we have cannabis legal in medical or recreational form in over 40 states now. And so that is what is really inspiring to me, right? And I don't think that these plants ever should have been criminalized. And so I'm glad that we're reversing 75, 100 years of prohibition in some cases. And so mushrooms just seem to be the next wave, right? And I think cannabis legalization was really a great gateway drug, if you will, to legalizing these other plant medicines. And I think as people saw cannabis becoming more mainstream and accepted, it made it a lot easier to swallow the idea of psychedelic mushrooms or other plant-based medicines. Maybe the government's been telling us the wrong thing, right? Maybe it's been propaganda this whole time. And so when I first saw mushrooms moving in this space, I was actually at a CBD conference in Denver, and it was like a joint conference. It was the first one I had seen. It was like CBD and psychedelic science. And I was like, that's an interesting combo.
Yeah.
And it just so happened to be on the day after Denver voted to decriminalize mushrooms. So that was the first city in America to decriminalize mushrooms. It passed by less than 51%. It was like 50.5%. and I got invited to this little mushroom pop-up thing at the conference. I didn't know what I was walking into. And you know, I thought maybe it was going to be like a mushroom bazaar, and you know, people selling chocolate bars and
Yeah.
you know, doing dancing to rave music. But quite the opposite. It was just a bunch of activists sitting around talking about how they got that measure passed. They were really candid that they didn't expect it to pass. It was just kind of like a you know, the first step in a political statement to
Mm.
get in front of you know, local authorities. But to their pleasant surprise, it did pass. And then you know, it became the scramble of, okay, well, now how do we help to shepherd this in the most responsible, conscious way, you know, not opening it to drug abuse, but really doing what they intended when they aim to decriminalize mushrooms, is, you know, keep people out of prison for these things first off, and then, you know, educate people on how to use them and integrate them into their life.
Yeah. Cool. You know, it is it's an exciting time. Never in my wildest dreams did I expect to see marijuana legalized and to have psilocybin mushroom psychedelics. I'm able to prescribe legally ketamine therapies in our centers in Oregon and Utah. We have the whole psilocybin assisted therapy ballot measure in Oregon, where I have friends that are facilitators and have spaces up there that they're doing it legally. And then there's this whole kind of underground market that has been happening, since the dawn of people on the planet, I suppose. Um, you know, it seems like what happens in particular with psychedelics, the legalization or decriminalization, um, is not possibly not just a green light for people to say like, hey, this is safe. I think doing these things in appropriate manner, and this is coming from, I chose my undergraduate school by how many Grateful Dead shows I could see on the East Coast. So I definitely, I do have that background in me as well. So to never in my wildest dreams would I think to see that we would be living in this time where there would be an openness about it, but there is a lot of therapeutic benefit when used properly. And there's a lot of substances that do alter consciousness, and there can be some harms that come from there. Maybe you want to speak into that a little.
Yeah, definitely. We've termed that the Palan effect. It's named after Michael Palan, who wrote the
Oh,
book
yes.
How to Change Your Mind. It was
Yeah.
published in 2019. You know, he's a New York Times best-selling author and a baby boomer, right? And he wrote this book starting as a skeptic on psychedelics, right? Because he was hearing about people having these, life-changing experiences from it. I think he tried it once in college or a couple of times, and he, you know, was came to it as someone who didn't believe it. And by the end of the book, he's tried basically every psychedelic drug there is, and completely, you know, changed his mind about it. And I think it's been a really influential book for, you know, many generations, but especially the boomers, you know, who grew up with all this propaganda and the drug war and Nancy Reagan, and so I mean, I think with all of these things, right? We saw the same thing with cannabis, and cannabis is now legal for anyone over 21 here in California, where I am. And so for when cannabis first became legal, or let's go back to before it was completely legal, right? There was concerns about, you know, children getting their hands on cannabis, or them not testing for mold or pesticides. All these things were something that was done under the Medical Cannabis Act. Any quality grower, you know, worth their salt is going to be testing their products. But what I found really kind of hypocritical was, as soon as legalization passed, everyone who owned a dispensary or legal product, you know, was going out and saying, now the first thing you want to do is never buy anything from outside the recreational market. You know,
Hmm.
whereas, you know, a year ago, 2 years ago, they're like, you know, you got to try the medical market. It's really
Hmm.
great. It's safe. It's nothing to worry about. And so I think that, you really have to look at, where the negative news is coming from. And ironically now, a lot of that negative propaganda around illicit cannabis is coming from the same people that were fighting for the legalization of cannabis. And I don't blame them. The taxes are pretty onerous, and it's tough to survive in a business in California, especially when 90+% of cannabis sales are still happening outside of that legal framework. But when I was just at South by Southwest with some other panelists, and we were talking about the mushroom underground and like psychedelic entrepreneurship. And so that day in Denver, when I went to the mushroom pop-up, a couple of the people that I met that actually organized the event are a group called Oakland Hyphae and Hyphae Labs, right? And so when I was in cannabis early on, I started in 2008 professionally. And at the time when you would go into a dispensary, there were edibles, right? Brownies, root beer, gummies, but there was no like standard unit of measurement. So if you wanted to know like how strong this is going to be, how much medicine is in there, what's going to be the effect, you'd read it and it would say like 10 skull and crossbones. And you're like,
Yeah.
well, I don't know what that means, but it sounds scary.
Yeah.
And consequently, almost everybody who's ever tried a cannabis edible, especially prior to, these legal frameworks, they have the experience of like, yeah, I had a little bit, I didn't really feel it, so I had a lot more, and then it was way too much,
Right.
And so my career to legitimize plant medicine has always been about making it more like medicine. And so I was only, 24 years old, but me and my partners started a trade association for cannabis edibles manufacturers. And in 2010, legalization was first on the ballot here in California. And edibles were kind of on the chopping block because regulators weren't sure how to regulate them, right? Cannabis is one thing, food is another thing with its own set of regulations. How can you regulate, this hybrid sort of product? And so as the trade association got all the biggest edibles manufacturers together, and we went to one of the first labs, was a lab in Oakland called Steep Hill. And we called them and said, hey, we want to create some standardization in edibles and labels. And the first rule of our club is you got to test every batch of edibles. What do you think? Can we have the meetings at your place? And they're like, They were so excited because testing wasn't a requirement, and
Right.
they're just starting out. They're trying to get business. They rolled out the red carpet for us, and that's why today, edibles say 10 milligrams of delta 9 THC, and you can really control your dose. And so when I met Reggie, Tomas, Ian of Hyphae Labs, I was asking them the same thing. I was like, so when you test a mushroom, what is the variance of potency that you find, And they say, well, the potency can range from 0.1% actives to, 2%. That's a variation of 20x, And so right now on most underground mushroom products, they're labeled as 3.5 or 4 grams of mushrooms per chocolate. But that, gives you some sense, but not a true sense of the strength of those mushrooms. And so I see like the next, step, even I bet you will happen in the underground market before it's legally required to do so, is people testing their product and showing precisely not just how much mushrooms is in there, but exactly how much psilocybin or psilocin or baeocystin, all of the actual actives that are going to give you that effect.
Yeah.
So yeah, it really came full circle, especially since these guys were out of Oakland as well. Oakland also was one of the first cities that was decriminalized, so it allowed them to, legally be able to test these mushrooms. Right? They're not buying them, they're not selling them. They're just doing research. And years later, I ended up sharing the stage with Reggie Harris, who's the head of that lab, and we're friends now, and kind of been doing this rolling tour with this panel.
Interesting. Well, so then it might be a good segue into kind of the plant medicine culture. around like what are you seeing? I mean, we are living at an exciting time. What are you seeing the influences of drug and plant medicine culture kind of infiltrating the general population here? Because it is a pretty big wave that is happening. And when we're talking about consciousness expanding medications, plants, I mean, I'm a naturopathic physician and Chinese medicine practitioner, and I always found it odd that we've outlawed plants and plant medicines that are naturally growing on the planet. Uh, so if we just talk about that aspect or that component, then we're going to circle back around into mushroom specific nootropics, brain health, brain regeneration, longevity. But maybe let's just touch on this component as a talking point here.
Yeah, well, because of the move now where it seems mushrooms are on the path that cannabis led, first starting with decriminalization, then legal for medical use in states like Oregon and Colorado, and then the media attention it's getting between Michael Pollan's book, Fantastic Fungi on Netflix has been really influential. And then, everybody from Joe Rogan to Gwyneth Paltrow to Prince Harry talking about their own psychedelic mushroom experiences. I think that is part of what is making it more of a curiosity for people. And then I think it's leading to a lot more of the research, right? There's multiple companies that have raised hundreds of millions of dollars towards coming up with novel compounds that they can patent and sell to pharmaceutical industries. And so a ton of research is going back into, how different psychedelics are affecting the brain with serious issues like treatment-resistant depression, PTSD. My most recent article for Rolling Stone was about how Joe Biden just approved $10 million for veterans, for active duty veterans, for psychedelic treatment for PTSD. And so I think between the celebrities pushing it and then the science backing what shamans and plant medicine legacy people have known or experienced for generation, I think it's just being able to affect a larger audience. My dad, for example, right? He's fascinated by the science behind it and proving it, right? There's nothing his hippie son could tell him that's going to change his mind about it. But if Johns Hopkins puts a report out about it, then that's something that he'll listen to.
It's got some more legitimacy, and that PTSD is a recalcitrant condition, with not a lot of great treatment options as of yet. And then you get some of these early research projects showing 77% effectiveness, of total resolution for vets. That's pretty miraculous, and definitely something to look at. So I'm excited for them. I'm cautiously optimistic. I'm a radical optimist at heart, but we did have round one. I always used to look back at the 70s of the 60s. I missed the decade, and now come full circle. Been medical director of Harmony Event Medicine, of helping with rock med scenarios out in the wilds of festivals of Oregon. Can legally prescribe psychedelics in my centers, and then have this burgeoning culture component around interest level and desire. There's a lot of folks looking at mushrooms in particular, microdosing, functional mushrooms with the nootropic benefits as well. We have Paul Stamets out there that I've seen lecture for 25 years now in the naturopathic community, now coming out on some really large stages. Maybe you want to speak into the mushroom component, functional mushrooms, and then maybe that microdosing component for people that may be interested.
Sure. Well, yeah, like you said, functional mushrooms have been used for thousands of years, inherent in Chinese medicine, and I liken the kind of the shine or the wave of interest that functional mushrooms are getting akin to CBD's interest as marijuana or cannabis was legalizing. I got calls from a lot of people in my family. I was like kind of the black sheep of the family until marijuana became more accepted, legalized, and there was a piece in 2014 on CNN with Sanjay Gupta talking about CBD and talking about how it has a ton of the benefits of cannabis, but without the psychoactive effects. And that particular piece of media, I think, was one of the biggest things for the CBD industry, and just another person that was legitimizing it in so many people's minds. Just really credible source. And so as more and more studies and people talking about microdosing and the neuroplasticity or the neurogenesis, which if your listeners don't know, that means like actual formation of new brain cells and new neural connections, is something that the science is showing microdosing psilocybin does for people. Similarly, lion's mane, which is a legal functional mushroom, also has this effect on the brain. And Paul Stamets himself suggests taking lion's mane and microdoses at the same time because of their synergistic effects working together. And I liken it to kind of forging a new path through the woods. I have a little bit of experience with microdosing, a ton of experience with lion's mane. And in my experience, I think one of the reasons why psychedelic tests are not completely conclusive is for a couple of reasons. One, the people who take the placebo know for sure they got the placebo, right? They're not seeing colors or
Right.
having new revelations. But two, also, I was talking to an investor who invests in biomed, and he was just really trying to have me explain, why is some of these psilocybin companies not doing as well, or their tests are inconclusive. And I said, well, with pharmaceuticals, they're really designed to take your brain from one point to another point, right? It's supposed to change your mind in exactly this way. Whereas psilocybin is more of a tool, right? And so it gives you the enhanced awareness, I think, to be able to break out of, deeply ingrained habits or things that we're used to in not just like our rituals of going for a run or journaling, but in just the way we actually think and process thought. But that still leaves it up to the consumer to make that change, right? It's not that psilocybin, you take this and then you're going to like the Grateful Dead, you're going to immediately start to finger paint. It doesn't make people act all one way, right? Rather, it sort of reveals the things that are holding ourselves back, or self-imposed misery, for lack of a better word, and allow you the opportunity to make that change for yourself.
That's well put. It's kind of like it's an inside job and it sheds the light on it. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah, which is hard. I think I've seen that in the ketamine industry, where venture capital has gotten in, and these are sacred plants. I would put them in that category, and to utilize them in a non-heartfelt manner, I don't think you get as good of results. And so it's an interesting way. The way that I kind of talk about it is there's a new economy potential, and not just on dollars and cents, but a way to bring heart back into transactions and bring that relational action back of our heart connections in commerce, which is really tough to do, right? It's hard to scale with heart. It's definitely easier to scale without heart, and we see that kind of what is happening out there. And so by bringing in a consciousness aspect, or an awareness with a very potent medicine or medicines, this whole class, that's proving to be interesting. I'd say we're not doing a good job in the ketamine world. In Utah, what I've seen, it's there's mills and they're just churning people through. There's not a lot of care taken. It's not just like, here, take this, purple pill, and now all of your issues are gone. I mean, there's still work to be done. Like you said, this is more of a tool, not an end product. And I think the care needs to be in that discussion at higher levels of how do we actually implement this, rather than, yes, it's got to make economic sense, but ultimately we're talking about healing, people healing themselves and giving them the right tool to do that. I think this is how they became outlawed in the late 60s, early 70s, is that, the powers that be did not like the creativity nor the thought processes that were arising from it, of we're questioning authority, we're questioning our programming, we actually, maybe we're not doing things the right way, maybe this, it became too much for society at large to cope with. And so, now it's kind of, it's back, right? Like you wouldn't think that you can't get rid of a potent medicine like this. And so it is back. And, kind of full circle into my discussion around it, of like, the caretaking of this time and this transition, because, there are a lot of dollars on the line, and that, sometimes you will get some bad actors in there just monopolizing or going for massive profit. I have nothing against massive profit, but not at the expense of people's health, right? As a physician in the field, and really bringing back and speaking into bringing the heart back into healthcare, that matters. And so that's an interesting. I'm wondering if you're hearing those discussions and some of the panels that you're on.
Yeah, that's what the most interesting thing I find about the emerging market, specifically of psychedelics, right? Is like the most anti-capitalist substance that naturally found on Earth, and everybody's trying to find an opportunist way to, sell their services of improving your life by draining your wallet. And so it's very meta, very 2024. And I think that really trying to understand like who is really genuine with their intentions with these super strong medicines is very challenging.
Yeah.
And you're right. I mean, it is hard to build a giant conglomerate that is, well organized based on their morals and their values, rather than, how much money can we make. But, if there's any industry that I believe, could do this, it's psychedelics. And I think it also comes down to the consumer, right? And I always say that the consumer is the person who has the power to fire CEOs, right? And that's because they're making their decisions with their dollars. And so I hope that the consumer will continue to become more educated. I don't know, through use of taking the psychedelics or not, but that they're going to want to know where their products are coming from, that they're going to people that, are good leaders in the industry. And so that's something that a lot of my colleagues are working on, testing products out there, kind of publishing it for the public to see, what exactly is in these products that are out circulating in the underground economy. And people ask me too, like, well, because I always say, ask a friend, go to, like, kind of like going to your local farmer, right? If you want to get the best produce, just go to the source. And people say, well, I don't have that person in my community. Another great, like, online watchdog, real honest community is Reddit. And Reddit psychedelics has tons of reviews. Basically, you can look up almost any product or brand that's out there, and you'll have a lot of anecdotal information, and then citizen scientists too. Like, hey, I put this in my HPLC, and I tell you exactly what's in there. And so the community around mushrooms, I think, is really what is, it's what draws me to it. And the last thing I want is to see that wholesome community co-opted and changed, because I really experienced that in cannabis, and I hope, that
Yeah.
that because of the, truly transformative, conscious expanding properties of these medicines, that people will seek out companies that are true actors, and that I think more and more the veil of phoniness or authenticity is really starting to slip. Maybe it's we're all just so exposed to ads constantly that I think, people more and more are more discerning about, who is a true actor.
Yeah. Lovely. And so with you in emerging markets, going from cannabis now into mushroom realm, you have a company called Micro Boost. And so what inspired you to get going on that?
Yeah, so I have a supplement manufacturing company called Custom Capsule Consultants, and part of my job is when people contact me, they'll either have an idea for a product that's very specific. I want ashwagandha, I want elderberry, and tell me something like that, or they'll say, I want a brain nootropic. And during the COVID pandemic years, that was like one of the most popular types of products that people were asking about. And consequently, a ton of people were asking about lion's mane. And I got into, a lot of formulating for different companies using lion's mane. And it got me really down the rabbit hole of mushroom supplements. And I learned a couple of really crucial things. One, you got to have the right amount of lion's mane or any supplement for it to be effective. And there's a common thing in the supplement industry that I've coined as fairy dusting, where you put a little bit of ashwagandha, a little bit of lion's mane in there. You can put it, in bold lettering on your packaging. But if it's not enough for an effective dosage, it is just like sprinkling fairy dust on there. So I
Right.
kind of got back and forth with some of these company owners, and they're like, well, we don't care that not enough lion's mane fits into a serving. We just want to market it as such. I was like, aren't you spending a ton of money to
Yeah.
convince people to try your product? You just want them to, hopefully just keep taking that placebo forever. Why not just give them a really good product?
Right.
And then not only like the amount of mushrooms in there, but where it's coming from as well. And so I learned that when you grow mushrooms commercially, they're grown on like a starchy substrate, right? Like some sort of rice or grain or corn, and you inoculate that substrate with the liquid culture, the spores of the mushroom, and from there, the root system of the mushroom grows, the mycelium, and it fills out that substrate, and the fruiting body is like the stem and the cap, the mushroom that actually protrudes from that culture. And so at MicroBoost and companies that use fruiting bodies, would harvest that mushroom, powderize it. In MicroBoost case, we make it into like a concentrated version, so we can get even more actives into small form factors like vegan soft gels or gummies, or a single tablespoon of coffee. But what I learned was a ton of these bigger mushroom companies, again, like going for profit rather than quality, they don't buy the fruiting body mushrooms. They buy the myceliated oats that are otherwise, going to be thrown out by these mushroom farmers. And they pulverize the oats and put that into their capsules or their coffee, and saying, oh, 600 milligrams of lion's mane.
Whoa.
In fact, it's actually mostly dirt is what you're getting.
Wow.
It might be really high quality dirt, but if you're paying $40 or $50 for a mushroom coffee, and that's what you're getting, well, that is just like complete bait and switch.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, it was born out of frustration with other companies, just like cutting corners, and me not agreeing with that, and thinking, if we could make a quality product, we convince people to try it, and then they actually have great effects from it,
Yeah.
hopefully they'll come back. And so,
That's such a novel approach. You're making a good quality product that gets results. Wow.
yeah. And so I wrote an article about this for Rolling Stone too. And at first I thought, what could the difference be? I mean, there are some benefits to mycelium. There's some actives in mycelium that are
Yeah.
good for your brain, studies show. But the actives are prevalent, like are present about the same amount that like psilocybin is in mushrooms, which is 1% or less. On
Wow.
average, like 0.5%. And originally going into the research, I thought maybe fruiting bodies are 10 to 1,
Yeah.
stronger than these myceliated oats. But when I actually got down to it, it's more like 500 to 1.
Wow. Wow.
And so, a challenge for fruiting body companies like ours, right, is you see two products on Amazon or the shelf at Whole Foods, and it's this giant tub of mushroom capsules, for $20. And then, we have a 30 count soft gel that's $24.99, and it really is dwarfed by
Yeah.
this big thing of capsules. But one of our soft gels actually has more than the entire container
Wow.
of their capsules.
How would the consumer know? Are you starting to label that like these are 100% fruiting bodied mushrooms, or
Yeah,
how would?
definitely. We put it on our packaging. Any mushroom company that's using fruiting bodies now knows to put it on their packaging. And we're working with our supplier of functional mushrooms, who's actually petitioned the FDA to require truth in labeling on mushroom packaging, and explaining to them mycelium is not a mushroom, just like the roots of an apple tree are not an apple, right?
Mm,
And so they're saying to the FDA, hey, if you want to sell myceliated oats, no problem. Just don't call it a mushroom. Don't put mushroom imagery on your packaging, because it
yeah.
really is confusing the consumer and
Yeah.
obfuscating what's in there. And I saw CBD kind of go from like one of the fastest boom to bust industries I've ever been a part of. And
Yeah.
I don't want that to happen to mushrooms, because I think same thing. A bunch of opportunists jumped in to making CBD, rushed to market, made a bunch of poor to mid quality products at best. People try these things and they're like, I don't get the hype,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
then kind of rule out the ingredient altogether. And CBD is really powerful, as are most cannabinoids, but functional mushrooms, I think, even more so. The history of use in medicine is thousands of years, and that's what I want. I want people to try MicroBoost. I would love if they bought MicroBoost, but really, I think that mankind could benefit from taking high quality functional mushrooms, and in some people's cases, psychedelic mushrooms too.
Indeed. Awesome. Well, I think that we'll pull it into the station with that, Rob. I think, is there any last parting closing messages of inspiration you'd like to share with our listeners and viewers?
Well, I mean, one other source of MicroBoost was from a company retreat that we did, and we did a little like Shark Tank style pitch where we had different people from different departments, whether marketing or production, sales team, and it was from that Shark Tank like little challenge that the name MicroBoost came, that some of the formulas, and for any entrepreneurs out there, or people working in companies, like I found that opening the floor to people's ideas, whether they're the ones packaging gummies or writing the marketing manifesto. A lot of people have a lot of ideas about what they're doing, especially if this is their full-time job. And so for anybody out there beating their head against the wall trying to come up with a good idea, I'd say just ask the people around you, and maybe even the ones that you least expect will have the best idea.
I love it. Thank you so much for that. That's beautiful. All right, you all listening out there in our viewer land, if you like today's show, definitely give us a like and go out, give us a 5-star review, and write down what you learned out of the show today and share it. This is coming from us to you. It's not coming from the top down. We're bringing this information direct to you. This is a new and emerging field, and it's a very fun time to be alive. So thank you all. We wouldn't be doing it without you. Thank you, Rob, for coming on the show.
Thanks, Greg.